This episode of Hello PhD is sponsored by Promega and listeners like you. Thanks for your support.
I can't believe how long your PhDs go for.
I can't either.
It's mad. You're so old by the time that you finish. Yeah, come to Australia. Just come to your PhD here. It'd be fantastic.
Welcome to Hello PhD, a podcast for scientists and the people who love them. This week, we explore graduate programs that grant PhDs in under 5 years with no money down. Stay with us.
And we're back. This is Hello PhD, episode 115. I'm Joshua Hall.
I'm Daniel Arneman.
And we'll discuss the human side of science and life in the lab. Hey, Dan. Happy Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah. Now, everybody should know that this year you were kind enough to invite me on a camping trip.
Yep, for the long weekend. Some friends, some mutual friends invited.
Yeah, everybody's going.
A fun family camping trip in the beautiful, great outdoors.
And planned months ago, I think. Or at least a month ago.
Well, yeah, I think it was about 6 to 8 weeks ago, we decided we should go on a camping trip, which many of us have done before.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think the original goal was that this would happen in late April, early May, but scheduling difficulties. The first weekend we could settle on was here at the end of May, which seemed fine 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And when I got that email, I was so excited. I clicked the delete button as fast as I possibly could because, as you know, I am the worst outdoor sleeper. I have to have all of the comfort of home.
Yeah, you're not a sleep outside in a tent.
Nope, I don't like to be
person.
hot. I don't like the dew to settle. I'm very it's tough enough for me to sleep in my own house, let alone out in the great outdoors. So anyway, you guys went, and I think it was 95 degrees outside.
It was really hot.
And then a thunderstorm rolled through.
Yeah, we actually had to, we called it quits. I actually decided probably around 2:45 a.m. when it was still 78 degrees outside, and I had not yet gone to sleep.
99% humidity then?
Yeah, it said 100% humidity
100%
actually on my weather app that I was staring at 2:45 a.m. I said, we're not sleeping here another night. And, as insult to injury, a random rain shower passed through unannounced and started raining on us. And, of course, we didn't have our rain fly on the tent. And here's how hot it was, Dan. It was so hot that when it started raining into our tent from the open top, my first thought was, wow, that feels good.
That is a great camping adventure.
But we had some good times during the day. Had some
maybe
fun,
next year I will just automatically send that email to spam. But thanks for inviting me.
Sounds good, Dan. Well,
we got something cool today at least.
Yeah, one thing that is refreshing is this beer that we're drinking. Dan, this is a beer that I believe you brought back from some travels you did a month or so ago.
I did. I went to Knoxville, Tennessee.
Yep, and this is a Tennessee beer. This came from Johnson City, Tennessee. This is the Yeehaw Dunkel from Yeehaw Brewing. I believe, Dan, this is not our first Tennessee beer, but I believe this is our first Dunkel.
Why haven't I made the map yet? The beer map.
That's a feature I keep requesting.
Okay, I'll work on it.
So, Dan, let me tell you, since Dunkel, this is our first Dunkel, I wanted to get us on the same page to make sure we knew what a Dunkel was.
Please.
So Dunkel, like a lot of beer types, has its origins in Germany. And Dunkel is actually a German word. You're the word guy. Do you have an idea what Dunkel might mean?
I do not.
It means dark.
Which stands to reason, because when you pour this in my glass, it is we're not as dark as the stout we had the last other time, but this one is quite dark. I would call it a darker than rusty. What would you call that?
Well, yeah, that's right on.
Chocolate colored?
Right on cue for a typical Dunkel. So most Dunkels range in color from amber to dark reddish brown. Would you say this is a dark reddish brown?
Well, I the word was rusty when you held it up. But yes, it's darker than that.
Yeah, and they are typically characterized by their smooth malty flavor. So are you getting a smooth malty flavor, Dan?
I am getting a smooth malty flavor, a little burnt sugar, maybe a little coffee.
Yeah, I would say, while maybe not a sibling, this is a close cousin to a stout or a porter, I
think a little lighter in the mouthfeel department.
There's a lot of flavor in this beer, and one thing that actually surprised me, I was curious what the ABV is of this beer, 5.5%.
So middling?
Yeah, and typically Dunkels are not known to be super high gravity. They have sort of this sort of mid-range alcohol content, but lower than a Doppelbock.
Is this style a style you would drink again, or it's not your favorite?
I think so. I think I would drink this. This is something, and Dan, you've been out to drink beers with me before. I'm a big fan if I go to a brewery that has a large selection of many types of beer. I don't like to commit to the whole pint. This is a beer I could see myself getting a 10-ounce pour and enjoy for a little while before moving on to something
Before
else.
switching flavors.
Yeah, but it's a good mix-up, I think, if I was between an IPA and maybe a Pilsner or something.
All right. Well, I'll take you up on that next time we go out. Speaking of switching to something else, we have a new Patreon patron this week.
We sure do, Dan. Special thanks to Bryce for joining our growing group of Patreon patrons.
Thank you, Bryce. Josh, let's also not forget that on June 4th, Promega is hosting a webinar discussing applications of CRISPR-Cas9 mediated gene editing and how you can use it to study protein dynamics in live cells without overexpression. I know that you are probably not doing a lot of CRISPR work right now, but for our listeners who are, go to promega.com/hellophd for more information and a link to register.
Dan, I run an educational program for a post-bac program for students who are pre-graduate school. And at the beginning, when they start in June, we learn about some different lab skills and different training related to working in the lab. And we're actually doing a session on CRISPR.
Oh, that's exciting.
Maybe I'll direct them to this webinar.
Then you could just sit in the back
Sit in
and
the
drink
back.
coffee.
That's right.
Perfect. All right, Josh. Well, let's get to our main topic.
All right, Dan. So last week we took a walk down memory lane and went into the archives and dug up a discussion we had a few years ago on this idea of a fixed-length 5-year PhD.
And the feedback was deafening.
Yeah, a lot of people, this struck a nerve for a lot of people.
Struck a nerve from a lot of people in a lot of different media. I was noticing we were getting commentary in our patron Slack channel, on the website, via Twitter, via email. It felt like skywriting was coming next. People really had strong feelings about this one.
Which is great.
That's what you wanted.
That's what I wanted. I have strong feelings.
You do. For those who hadn't heard the last episode, we talked about the pros, cons, challenges, promises of having a PhD that ends in just 5 years on a schedule.
And, one thing, Dan, I was hoping to accomplish from this, besides getting a conversation going, was I was really eager to learn if there actually are PhD programs out there doing this. Now, we knew already about these Australian programs from our conversation with Talia we'd already had. We're gonna play that for you in just a moment. But Dan, we actually did hear back from a couple of listeners who are in 5-year fixed PhD programs here in the U.S.
Okay, well, do you want to tell us where some of these are and some of the comments?
So we heard from Rebecca, who is a grad student at UCLA's Molecular Biology Interdepartmental Doctoral Program, and it's a 5-year PhD program. Now, Rebecca admitted that she is starting this fall, so she doesn't have a lot of experience to share from being in the program.
Could be terrible, could be great. We don't know yet.
It could be. But she did say that the 5-year design definitely was a factor for her when choosing a program and deciding to accept their offer, which totally makes sense.
I wonder if this is a way that programs can become competitive by helping students understand how to plan for their lives. Maybe I'm married. Maybe I want to have kids. Maybe I have, I want to spend the next 5 years after this in Spain. Knowing when I'm going to finish would help me make those life decisions. So
yeah, that's a great point, Dan.
It could be a tiebreaker in a application process.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, and she said that the program explained it to all the students who were interviewing that about 5 or 6 years ago, they redesigned the program to make it so that if you followed the structure and did everything you needed to do, you'd be done in 5 years. Now, if something goes wrong, you can extend by a semester or two, but it seemed like they highly discouraged this, and it's only for extenuating circumstances. So there is a way, it's not a 5 years and you're out no matter what. It seems like there's a release valve if something goes wrong, but the program setup is that most people will be done. And she said part of the way that they shave off some of the time is limiting classes for being only during the first year. And then I think this is important, Dan, having a lot of checkpoints throughout the 5 years to give frequent feedback and guidance to keep things moving along.
Good foreshadowing, because we're going to talk a lot about that after we hear from Talia. I think that's one of the features that we heard again and again is going to be important, is those frequent check-ins.
Also, Dan, I'd be remiss not to say Rebecca also mentioned that she's a fan of the podcast and said that Hello PhD has been a huge help for her over the past year and a half as she decided whether grad school was right for her through the application and interview process, and now she prepares to start her program. So that's awesome, Rebecca, and certainly best of luck, and please keep in touch and let us know how things are going.
Yeah, and we actually reached out to people in the UCLA program, so hopefully in the future we can talk to somebody who's administrating that, who made the decision to switch to that type of program. Be great to hear from them. Josh, we also heard from Sherry, who is in a 5-year time-limited PhD program at the University of Colorado. It's a clinical and health sciences program, and so all of the students are former clinicians, which might contribute to the fact that they can finish on this time schedule. They already have a specific background, but they apparently take preliminary exams at the end of the second semester, and then qualifying exams occur before the end of the fifth semester, dissertations at 4.5 years on average, and no one has taken longer than 5. So she says she enjoys that model. She knows what the milestones are, like when a first authorship is due, and whether she's progressing toward the degree, which I think it takes a lot of stress out of the process. You know, I'm hitting these milestones. I know that I'm doing what I need to do to graduate.
Yeah, and she went on to say that knowing that end date was quite motivating for her. And she said, I have little doubt that I will actually finish. Goal setting is simplified. Dan, I know you mentioned that was a big source of stress for you, was not even the stress of when am I going to finish, but am I even going to? Does this end?
Yep. Will it go on for another 5 years and then I just don't get the degree? That was always an option and always a fear that I had. So sounds like a program like this would have been better for me to at least be able to, I guess, take care of my mental health in such a way to know that the end was in sight, and then I could have done it.
Yeah. And so Sherry says, I'm at the end of my second year and now attend conferences with the goal of informally interviewing for postdoc positions. I'm meeting potential new PIs and setting a plan for applying for postdoc funding as needed. I find that the time limit helps me plan for success in the next step of my career. Pretty cool.
Now we just pushed the uncertainty to your postdoc, which I'm sure we'll get into
the time limited postdoc, right?
Yeah, next week on the show.
But Dan, I gotta tell you, I am just over the moon to find out that just in our little Hello PhD audience, there are 2 listeners who are in these types of programs here in the U.S.
Yeah, and as you travel on conferences, it may be fun to find these people. I mean, I assume you'll attend conferences where UCLA and University of Colorado people will be. Would love it if you'd follow up and find out what they say.
Well, you know why I'm kicking myself, Dan?
Why are you kicking yourself?
Because I was just at UCLA.
Oh, that's right.
A couple months ago.
I just remember the listener beer.
I know. If I'd have known about this, you can bet that I would have been looking up these people.
You absolutely would have. Well, Josh, that takes us to our interview with Talia. Everybody will remember in episode 111 on citizen science, we talked to Talia about her work on a citizen science project studying echidnas in Australia. But I took that time to also ask her about what graduate school was like in Australia, because we had heard rumors that things were very different in terms of funding and in terms of timeframes. And so let's listen to what she had to say, and then we'll come back and talk about whether we think those strategies could work around the world.
You know, we just gave some examples of 2 specific programs here in the United States with a time-limited PhD. But one of the things we found out from Talia was here's a whole country whose system is built around...
A continent, technically.
A
whole continent.
You know, where the entire system in Australia is built around this fixed-length PhD of not 5 years, Dan.
Dun, dun, dun.
But 3 years.
Okay, well, let's listen and find out what is possible someday in the future, Josh. Well, let me switch gears briefly, because I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the life of a graduate student in Australia. We have heard that it is very different from the United States. So tell us what the process is like.
It is a very different process, and listening to Hello PhD has given me such great insights.
Glad I'm not over there.
Into the US system, because I had no idea how it worked over here. So that's been really cool to compare the two. And, you know, if I want to come and do a postdoc over here, I have a bit more insight into how this sort of system works, which has been super, super helpful for me. So we have it. So straight after high school, you usually do an undergraduate degree.
4 years?
3 years.
3 years.
Yeah. So 3 years undergraduate degree. And, you know, then you specialize in particular areas. So you do usually 2 majors in, you know, genetics or zoology or environmental biology or physics, chemistry, all of those sorts of things. So you sort of start to pick your path in undergrads. You start with generalist subjects and you sort of get more specific throughout the 3 years. After that, we do what's called an honours year. And so that's like 1 year, or not even 1 year, like 9 months project where this is really the first time you're introduced to a lab environment. So during undergrad, we do, the normal lectures, tutes, practicals, like lab-based projects, but they're not actually in a physical lab.
Right, you know the results before you get started.
Exactly, yeah. They're all very pre-planned.
Yep.
And then, honours degrees is where you sort of join a lab, sort of like a mini master's, but you don't have any coursework anymore.
And everybody does one, or not everybody?
No,
Only
so
if you want to go on.
it's a choice. So if you want to go on for further research, you do your honours. So you can stop after an undergraduate degree if you want. There are limited jobs though if you just stop at an undergraduate degree,
Okay.
like a Bachelor of Science. So most people, if they want to continue with research or even just getting an industry job, would go on to do an honours.
And is the honors year just like being in university where you're paying to be there, or is it like a job where they're paying you to be there?
No, honours is still you're paying.
Okay.
So, you're still paying the university fees, although we have a great system in Australia where we've got this thing called a HEX debt, where you don't actually pay anything upfront for any sort of university degree at all.
Wow.
And it's not until you start earning over 55 grand a year, I think, as a job, and it starts to come out of your tax for you to pay
that's
back.
wild.
So some people never pay back their HEX debts if they
never find work that pays you more
if they never hit that, or if they don't work for that like long of a time sort of thing. So it's a great system in terms of money. We never have to fork out fees for university ever, which is amazing, unless you're an international student. then it's different. So during your honours year, you're basically given a project that you're in charge of. So sort of like a very short PhD. You do a literature review, you think of a hypothesis, you plan your experiments, and then you spend that rest of the 9 months doing.
But time box to 9 months is not this, we could be here 8 years or not.
Yeah. So, and essentially, it's not so much important about the results that you get if you make a significant impact in science. It's more about learning the process of how science works to begin with. You've got that finite point of time, and you don't have to necessarily get any significant results, but you do write a mini thesis at the end, and it's more about the process of learning how to do science, what science is really about, the scientific process, being able to think of an experiment, run an experiment, learn the techniques of whatever field that you're in, and finish at that point. So that's graded.
But everybody tends to finish and do well, and
it's
they're a finite project that is accomplishable. So when do you hit the brick wall of real science where things don't work?
Well, things don't always work in honours either, and I think that's an important process of learning about the scientific method, is that you could be troubleshooting for that entire 9 months and not actually get any significant results, but you're still allowed to finish. So
I see.
Yeah,
that makes
so
more sense.
as long as you write up about your experiments and you go through why didn't this work, or what experiments would you do next to make it work, and those sorts of discussion points in your thesis. So as long as you're still thinking like a scientist, you don't have to have presented anything mind-blowingly.
So with that honors year under your belt, does everybody go on to do more advanced, or can you take that honors year and go find a job?
Yeah, absolutely. You can finish honours, and because a lot of it's a learning experience, and people realize, research really isn't for me.
I don't like this.
So having that extra degree under your belt gives you better job prospects, and you do start to sort of learn about more industry jobs. Well, we're trying to, at least. At our university, I'm involved in a student-run club where we actually try to give undergraduate students and postgraduate students more insights into the industry world, because that's a growing thing. There's not that many research jobs out there anymore, so industry is an interesting avenue to take instead. So you can stop at the honours and get a job. You can get a research assistant or technical assistant job if you still sort of like the lab environment, but you just don't want to be doing actual hardcore research. Or you can go and do something completely different. And again, it's a funnel system, so not. You don't get that many students then going on to a PhD.
Right.
So you go from thousands of people doing an undergrad to probably hundreds of people doing a honours, and then maybe tens of people doing a PhD. So it's definitely a funnel system.
And that's the path you took. You decided more of this, please.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always been interested in learning just finding out new things. I think discovering things is super exciting. I did my honours in an ancient DNA lab, which is really cool. So basically taking DNA from fossils of a mammal that was extinct and figuring out how that's related to its living relatives. So
that is amazing.
that was a cool process, and I was opened up to the world of bioinformatics there as well, because I had no idea what bioinformatics was. I was not a computer person at all. I didn't know what coding was. It terrified me. So that was an awesome learning experience too. But I've always had that like hardcore passion for conservation, and so wanting to be able to make a difference and make sure that things don't go extinct rather than studying things that were already extinct. And monotremes are just the most ridiculous and amazing animals that I couldn't pass up the opportunity to work with them as well.
So how long is a PhD?
It starts off as only being 3 years.
It's ominous.
It's a short time.
Or eternity.
But you do, so that's what you're funded for initially. You get government or university funding usually. There's sort of two normal streams. And depending on what your grades are at the end of your honours is sort of depicted by which sort of scholarship that you get, if you get one. Most honours students do. There are a few that don't, but most people would get a scholarship, which is to cover like all university fees. You don't pay anything for university fees, and you get a stipend for living expenses.
Great. And it's livable? You can live on that stipend?
It depends on where you're living. So Adelaide is a very cheap and livable city.
Okay.
So absolutely you can live off of that and live out of home. So you can rent an apartment in the city and share with a couple of people, and it's it's not great, but like
manageable,
it's livable.
But somewhere like Sydney, maybe not.
Exactly, Sydney and Melbourne, they're much larger cities, and so you're probably, if you have to live out of home, you're probably still living like at least an hour outside of the city and have to come in and out sort of thing. But it's...
Take me back to it starts out as 3 years.
Yeah. Starts out as 3 years, but after 3 years you can get a 6 months extension for your scholarship. But your actual PhD from the university, you're allowed to go for 4 years. And then again, you can also get an extension for that if you want to. Most people try to finish between the 3.5, 4 years because you obviously don't want to be living without any money and trying to finish up a PhD. So that's always hard. And if you can finish before the 3.5 years, like you're golden. That's the best outcome.
Finishing means publishing. What does finishing mean?
There's different things for different universities. With our university, you can do pretty much any form of thesis. You can do just a completely unpublished thesis that's just all your own written chapters and you don't have any plan for publishing. You can do a full published thesis, which is either you've got the chapters published already or they're in manuscript form and you're planning on publishing them, or you can do a mix of two. So you can have a couple of chapters that are published and a couple of chapters that are just written up as chapters. So it's very flexible here, and there's no sort of minimum, maximum, how many publications, chapters. I think if you wanted a full publication one, you have to have at least 3 that are either manuscript ready or already published. But it's pretty manageable, and if you have a terrible experience as a PhD, you're not going to be stuck there forever.
You don't have a high attrition rate where people drop out partway through because they can't see the end. Yeah,
that's a good thing about the Australian system, is that there is kind of a finite end. You're at least for funding reasons, so that
there's a hard stop at the end, right?
Like you've got motivation to finish sort of thing. So there are people that I know that have taken 6 years or 9 years till they finish their PhD. A lot of the time they've gotten jobs and have sort of done it part-time, or have done a lot of teaching instead of doing so much of their PhD, so they've just sort of extended it forever. But they're quite good in Australia at keeping track of how you're going. So the university has systems in place where at a 6-month mark you have like a meeting with your supervisors and your panel, or the
committee, we would call it.
Yeah, and people in charge of the postgrads. You also sit down and make sure everyone's like going along at the 6-month mark, and then the 12-month mark, and then another 12 months after that, and you've got...
And that's baked in, or the student has to organize it?
No, that's like you get a notification being like, you have to get this done by this date.
Great idea.
And so it's a part of your PhD that you have to do all of those things, and everyone in the university is quite on board with that system as well. So sometimes it's just a formality, like you meet up with them, you have a casual chat being like, yep, everything's good, tick the boxes, done.
Right, but you were forced to be there and have the conversation.
Exactly.
I think in the United States, a lot of students get stuck in the, I will wait until I've got a little bit more to show before I schedule it, but then it never happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Until year 4 and it's a little late.
Yeah, and at our university, we've got this system where the postgraduate coordinator, they will be there in that meeting, and they'll have a part where the student will leave and they'll have a conversation with the supervisors, and then the supervisor will leave and they'll have a conversation with the student to make sure that if there is anything going wrong, that you can trust that you can talk to these people and bring up any concerns if that's happening, which I think is a great process as well.
That's amazing. Yeah,
there are some shitty supervisors out there.
There are, yeah, and there are some safety nets in place for when that happens. It's not
Absolutely.
if it happens; it's when it happens. That's amazing. Anything else about Australian PhDs and why we all wish we were in Australia?
Yeah, come to Australia. Just come to your PhD here. It'd be fantastic. Yeah, I don't know. Apart from, I can't believe how long your PhDs go for.
I can't either.
It's mad. Like you're
8,
so
9 years
old by the time that you.
It's an issue.
All right, Dan, that was fascinating. I love hearing from Talia, by the way.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, and I picked out a couple of themes in there that some of them knocked my socks off, and I wanted to get your impression as somebody who is in the business of minting graduate students. The first thing that stood out to me is, what on earth would it be like to have publicly funded or a university system that was paid for with no debt until you were able to pay it back, which is what she described. How would that change graduate student life?
Yeah, that's fundamentally different. Or, I'm just thinking my wife who's a public school teacher, or if you're in a profession where you don't ever reach that $55,000 threshold, which is really a lot of public servants or social workers or helper type careers, even police officers, how that might even encourage you to pursue these really important jobs that don't pay as well, where you don't have the added burden of having to pay for schooling.
Yeah, we are not economists, clearly. We're not a lot of things, clearly. But I looked up a little bit about the way that these HECS loans work, or HELP loans. So it's spelled HECS, or HELP. And basically the way it works is there's a graduated payback scale where if you make below $51,957 in 2018, then you don't pay anything back. If you make between $86,856 and $91,425, you pay back 6.5% of your HELP repayment income. So there's this graduated scale that automatically, when you submit your taxes at the end of the year, this money comes out of your income.
And it's a percentage of your income based on your income. I imagine up to the amount that your education cost.
Maybe that's true. I didn't quite understand what the percentage meant, but there's a graduated scale based on how much you make. Maybe it's a percentage of your income. Maybe it's how much debt you incurred. I don't know how they keep track of that, though.
Really interesting way of doing things. I'd be interested to know what the actual cost of education is there compared to here in the States, where, certainly the cost has skyrocketed over the last
paying back
number of
to
years.
you're 150 years old. But I think this could enable people who maybe take a job early because they need to start paying down these loans, or maybe it would affect things in the other direction where people continue on through school because they don't want to start paying back their student loans. I think it would just change the calculus. People would be able to pursue the things that made them passionate.
Well, Dan, one thing I always think about, and I talk to students about this when they like science as a high schooler or as an undergrad, considering programs like health careers, like medical school, nursing school, dental school. These are all programs you pay quite a bit of money to do. You go into pretty significant debt, at least in our country, to become a medical worker. And you contrast that to PhD training in the sciences where, most science-based programs here actually cover your tuition and pay you a salary while you're there. So it's very, very possible to get that PhD degree, make a fairly okay salary for a graduate student, and then come out the other side with your degree and no additional school debt.
Yeah, I think it'd be a game changer. I don't know how it would ever get done, but I thought it was interesting to put out there for all of us to be thinking about. How do we change the economics of going to school?
I thought this idea of this honors year that seemed to be an optional stepping stone between undergraduate for individuals who are interested in science and exploring research as a career.
Can I tell you what I thought about it at first?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I heard that and I was like, well, isn't that what undergrad is for? You do research as an undergrad, right? But then my second thought was, oh yeah, you should probably not be taking classes, not be living in your dorm room, doing actual science for a little while, which is exactly what my undergrad advisor told me. He said, take a year off, stay here, work in my lab for a year, and then apply. And I said, no, I got to get out of here. I need to go be a scientist. And it was a mistake. I should have stayed. And then I think I would have learned something about myself and about what science is like to do it day to day. And I may have made different choices.
Yeah, I think we both went straight from undergrad. And I agree, Dan. I had a similar experience. It was a bit of a shock to my system transitioning from my undergrad research experience to the full-time PhD experience at an R1 institution. And I was actually telling a student this today. You know, I had so much fun doing research as an undergrad in that environment at a small liberal arts school. And then suddenly when I'm a rotation student in this lab at an R1 institution, there's postdocs and there's lab technicians, and just the pace and the seriousness in that lab was so different than what I was accustomed to. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but research just seemed so much less fun than I had doing it in undergrad. And I really had a crisis where I thought, is this really where I want to be? What am I doing here? And so I think that transition would have been much smoother for me if I would have had the time to do this full-time research somewhere else, not as an undergraduate, before making the leap. And it made me think, Dan, we were talking about this a little before we started recording. You know, one of my real jobs is to direct this post-baccalaureate program for students who want to go on to PhD programs. And so they spend a year building skills on scientific communication and reading papers, and also working full-time in a lab for a year, very similar to this honors year that Talia talked about. But the whole goal of this post-baccalaureate year in our program is these are students who want to transition and move on to PhD training. So everything that they do during that year is with the purpose of helping them grow as independent scientists, learn what it's like to carry on a project full-time. So the feedback we've gotten over the last 10 years is these students have been really successful, partly because when they get to grad school, they're not surprised. They know what to expect, and they've built skills specifically to help them succeed in a PhD program.
I mean, it's akin to training wheels, which will keep you upright, and you'll be able to learn to balance, as opposed to just putting the kid on the bike and letting them scrape their knees, right? We throw people into this new culture, this new world of graduate school research, and we shouldn't be surprised when people bloody themselves a little bit.
So Dan, I mean, the thing that jumps out at me when I learned about this and heard Tali's interview is, you know, I wanted to do 5 years and thought that was radical.
Which was aggressive.
And now here's
people's minds were exploding when you said 5 years.
Here's a continent of people getting their PhD in 3 years. So I mean, how does that happen? Is this like a PhD light, or what's going on here?
No, in fact, I don't think it is a PhD light. We talked to some of our Patreon friends in Slack who are in Australia, and one of the people, Arlen, told us about her experience as a graduate student in Australia. She said that in some countries, like the United States, you start your PhD before you actually have a project, and then you take your first year or first 2 years to come up with a project. I think that's how you and I did it, right? You do rotations for 1 year, then you join a lab, and you pick a project in that process.
Yeah, and you know, it could be, for a lot of programs, it's not until maybe your third year you have this topic approval meeting where officially your committee approves the topic you will do for your thesis. Now, I know most people are probably working on some semblance of the precursor to that project, but you're right. I mean, at least a year goes by, right?
Before at least a year, probably two. And so there's 2 of our years taken up. Arlen says that in Australia, the PhD application is a project idea and proposal. So within a year, you have completed a full literature review, design the specifics of your project at all stages, and then you provide a report and present your project to a panel, which is their confirmation of candidature. You have to get ethical approval and things like that, but you have to show that your project is needed, that it's feasible, that you have the skill to carry it out, that it would benefit the world basically by doing it. And then you have 2 years to carry out the project and write it up. So I think what they're doing is front-loading some of the wandering around, trying out different labs. Do I want to research this or do I want to research this? Taking a bunch of classes. It's kind of, a lot of it's done up front. You spend a year doing your literature search, your background, and your design. And once your design gets approved, then you have this roadmap for how to get done. You seem scared.
No, I think that's great.
Do you think it would work? I mean, clearly it is working. So do you think it would have worked for us?
I do think so. I can remember my own program, and not all programs work this way, but in my PhD program, in our second year, at the end of our second year, we had this really extensive candidacy exam or prelim exam where we had to prepare 2 topics, 2 specific aims pages, not related to our actual research. And then we had to, I remember on the day the prelim period started, they would give us one envelope that was one of the 2 topics we had prepared in the semester before.
And the other was $100,000.
And you always chose incorrectly. But anyway, the topic you then got 6 weeks to write a full grant proposal on this topic. Again, not a topic that's related to your research. So
Proof that it can be done in 6 weeks.
Well, yeah, that's
which
true.
is interesting.
And since this was an exam, they were very strict about getting no assistance. So this was really as a second year grad student, kind of on your own. And first of all, I can remember taking that 6 weeks away from lab and research progress. But the thing I really remember is, this was a high stakes exam. So if you failed this exam twice, you're out of the program, right? And if you failed it once, you had to do the whole thing again. So the stakes were very high to do
the whole thing with a different topic. So
start from the beginning. Yeah. So what I remember was that I poured into the literature to understand this new topic, right? That was not my research topic. And by the time I finished the 6 weeks and I turned it in, I was so knowledgeable about all the background reading of this topic that I wrote my prelim on. But I was also so burned out that, and I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but not really because so much time has passed, I don't think I ever knew the background literature of my own actual graduate project as well as I knew the background literature of that prelim topic, because I think at that point I was so burned out. I just didn't feel, I was just ready to start doing research again. And I think what a waste, how much better off I would have been, and probably my PI, if I would have been able to put that same level of effort into the actual project that I would have been working on as a graduate student.
What if you had stepped out of lab for 6 weeks and figured out how to finish your actual PhD? What would that have looked like?
Instead of hitting pause, right, it would have actually probably accelerated my time to finishing, because I would have been so focused and knowledgeable starting back. So I can definitely see the benefits of this type of system that that Arlen and Talia were talking about. And Dan, one thing that jumped out at me was, and I think we talked about this last week, was a lot of our programs here in the States, our PhD programs, tend to have a publication requirement for graduation. And it sounded like from what Talia said, that in these Australian programs, many students do publish, but publication is not necessarily the gatekeeper for letting you out with your PhD. And that's a key difference.
Right, because publishing schedules are not easy, and we talked about people getting scooped. I think there's a lot we want to talk about, Josh, in terms of what does it mean to get a PhD. And I think we're going to have to come back to it, because right now the standard is publish, at least here in the United States. And I think what we're publicly talking about here is that's probably not the only or best measure of whether you have the skills to be a scientist, but we got to step back even from that. What does it mean to be a scientist and have a PhD?
Absolutely. And we received a lot of feedback this week from individuals who were saying pretty much the same thing. And that was sort of reiterating one thing we said on the show a lot of times, that you gain a lot of skills in PhD programs, not just hard technical skills, but all these soft skills. And if we're saying that you gain skills, skills can be measured. And so is there a way to actually measure the gaining of skills that we would want graduate students to have in a PhD program that might be a better indicator for a training outcome than just, oh, you got this paper published?
Yeah, and we're going to spend some time on that. So if you have ideas about that, please write to us, podcast@hellophd.com. That one stirs up a lot of feedback, and it's one that we're going to have to revisit.
Dan, so I think a great example of this was some feedback we got from listener Josh, not me, but different Josh.
You left a comment on the website.
I didn't even know we had a website, Dan.
I know. Every week I tell you.
We can leave comments on the website?
It's a real power that we have.
You made Dan's day, Josh, for doing that. So thank you. All right. So what Josh said was, while listening to the episode, I was reminded of a pedagogy workshop I attended at my university that suggested some alternatives to the traditional cumulative final exam for a class. The questions launched in this workshop were, what is the purpose of a final? What do we expect a final to measure or show? And do traditional finals actually accomplish what we want them to accomplish? You could turn this on the PhD process quite easily and frame in terms of backward design. What are the goals of a PhD? How do you know if you've achieved those goals? How do you measure achievement or progress? How do you design the instruction and activities to achieve the goals? I think it is absolutely conceivable to have a PhD take a fixed amount of time, but you first need professors and departments to figure out answers to some of the above questions. Too often, I think advisors and instructors just fall back on the way they learn things and continue using the same broken methods. By the way, and I thought this was, so this was exactly what we were talking about. So I thought the way he concluded this was really interesting. So Josh went on, by the way, I really like the comparison to medical school, but your conclusion that it's too different than PhD doesn't seem fair. What has been brought up time and again on your show is that a PhD teaches you a multitude of hard and soft skills. Skills can be measured and evaluated. In fact, I think the most important difference between the two types of programs is that the process to become an MD is very good at measuring skills, which is a necessity due to the high stakes involved. So I think he's totally right there. And that got me thinking a lot, his comment, that I think I have defaulted to this, this probably very common academic mindset, which is programs like medical school, dental school, pharmacy school, which are all time fixed length programs, that those are somehow fundamentally different than a PhD program. And I think what I would have said before Josh pushed me on this a little bit is that, well, these other health programs, these are vocational type programs that teach skills, and a PhD program, the goal of that, it teaches you how to think. But that's really a lot of hubris, Dan, like to sit here and say,
no one else knows how to think but us.
A PhD program. I mean, a doctor, sure, you may learn to do surgery on someone's heart while it's beating, but do you know how to think about it?
I think they stop the heart sometimes to do the surgery, and then
some bypass surgeries.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's so easy.
I don't know, Dan. I realized that's some pretty high level ivory tower bullshit that we have. So and I think that's part of I can't help but wonder if part of the pushback you get when you even suggest that a PhD program have this similar trait to many other programs in having some fixed end date is there's a little piece of those of us who have gone through it that holds on to this badge of honor that I went through this program and it wasn't over until the discoveries told me it was over.
What you're describing is hazing. It's really, that's what fraternities do, not what ivory towers should do.
Is there a real viable, practical reason why we have to do it that way? Some training purpose, right? But I thought the point was very well made that we had just talked about and that Josh mentioned. What are the skills needed? What are we trying to accomplish in a PhD program? And I think you're right, Dan. That is a much bigger
We're going to
question.
spend time on it, and we're going to have some maybe activities that our listeners can do to send us some of their thoughts. We'll keep you posted on that. On the 3 years, I just wanted to finish up with a couple of thoughts, Josh. Do you believe that mental health will be better with a fixed-term PhD? Do you think that it's better in Australia?
I think it'd be a fascinating research question. We have this very well-documented mental health crisis in our American STEM PhD programs. And, we have had our experiences, and we had a number of people over the last couple of weeks mention the anxiety that uncertainty gave to them during their training. It would be really fascinating to see if you have those same levels of anxiety with students in these more time-fixed programs, in a 3-year program, or even, Dan, now we have these 5-year programs. And I'm certain that is not the only contributing factor. I think there's so many issues and challenges that graduate students face. Dan, I can't help but wonder if it's not necessarily just the fixed length time frame of these programs. But the other thing we keep hearing time and time again from Talia and from Arlen and from the folks who wrote to us from these fixed length PhD programs in the States is they don't just chop it off at the end, but they institute all of these milestones, all of these stepping stones, all of these checkpoints for graduate students. So it's really, important. It's almost impossible to get lost and to spin your wheels. That's so prevalent in our current typical structure of PhD programs in the States.
Can I quote? This is a quote that I want everybody to get tattooed on their arms or stitched into your cross stitch pattern.
Give it to me.
this is my belief. You can tell me if it's wrong. Results don't create committee meetings, which is what we all believe. Committee meetings create results. We always sit and wonder, like, oh, if I just had a few more experiments, then I should schedule my committee meeting. And you never get the experiments done because you don't have the committee meeting. The moment it's scheduled, you will go do work, I promise.
No, you're absolutely right, Dan. I mean, we talked about, I like to call it the lab meeting phenomenon.
That's right.
I could remember how productive I was the week leading up to lab meeting, and maybe how unproductive I was the week after lab meeting when I didn't have to go again for a month. Because, if your end date is amorphous, what's really the motivation to do that PCR today versus putting it off till tomorrow?
Yeah.
But man, if you've got that committee meeting coming up and that deadline, I mean, it's just human nature at that point.
It is absolutely human nature. And I believe this is one of the things that without an act of Congress, without totally changing the way your program works, any administrator could institute a rule that says, I'm scheduling each student's meeting. I'm going to put it on the Google Calendar. I don't care where you put it. Somebody please try this. Put the student meetings on a calendar and make it a requirement and see if graduation doesn't happen faster as a result.
You hear that, program administrators and faculty?
It's my challenge.
If you are in a position to make change in your department, institute mandatory committee meetings for all of your students every 6 months.
Do you think anybody would object to this? Do you think anybody would say, that's a terrible idea, mandatory committee meeting?
I could potentially, this is the only thing I can imagine, Dan, that potentially faculty in a department, especially a larger department, saying, well, we just have too many grad students. That's too many meetings that I would have to go to.
Then you have too many grad students.
That's what I would say. Then you don't have the resources available for the proper care and feeding of your graduate students.
Oh, wow. One way of phrasing that.
I'm the grad student social services, and I'm going to come and extract those grad students, take them to a better home at UCLA or or at a different program.
I would love to see research on that, or I would love to see somebody just go institute it to find out whether that simple change could make, instead of trying to fix the end time, which is hard, instead of trying to pay for undergraduate education through some sort of payback tax system, which is hard, just put a thing on a calendar and tell me if it works.
You're absolutely right, Dan. And that's really worth saying explicitly that, our talking about this of potentially making a big change, a fundamental change to the way we do PhD training in the U.S., it really has nothing to do with us caring if a graduate program takes 6 years or 5 years or 3 years. What we care about is grad students are stressed, and grad students are spinning their wheels, and they're not seeing their own worth and their own value, and they're becoming demotivated.
That's the issue.
And that's what we want to address here.
Yeah, put those milestones on a chart and start moving toward them. I was really interested in the mentor feedback section that the student leaves the room while the committee talks, which I think happens in every committee meeting, at least everyone I've been in, and then you get called back in. But then there's also the situation where the mentor leaves and the student talks to the other committee members. I don't know how often that happens.
I've heard of that happening in certain departments, and I think that's a great idea. One caveat, Dan, while the intention of that is certainly great, giving a student the opportunity to speak freely about how things are going without their PI there. Oftentimes, a situation, if you think about your own committee, Dan, sure, when my PI is not there, but the other folks on my committee, one's like the department chair, one's like the good friend of my PI, one's the other person down the hall.
You wouldn't feel at liberty to discuss problems you were having.
Not necessarily. I think there's still a little bit of a power dynamic in these relationships among different people, but I think it's a great start.
Fair.
Right?
That's fair.
Yeah. So Dan, we got a lot of feedback from folks who were very positive about the idea of a change like this.
Everybody agreed. I filtered the people that didn't agree.
You didn't let that get through to me.
Anything about camping or people that disagree with me gets sent to spam.
But we did get some great feedback from some friends of the show, from our friend Adrian on Twitter, and our friend Jada, who's one of our Patreon patrons on the Slack channel, who agreed with some of the sentiments of wanting checkpoints and caring about student mental health, but that maybe the fixed length PhD wasn't the way to go.
Yeah, I think the concern was that it was going to, and this is what I predicted, is going to let people slip through the cracks, get a degree that maybe weren't ready. And the faculty member told a story about actually serving on a committee and having a student come through with a committee meeting. The student didn't really understand the background of the subject that she was studying. When this faculty member pressed her on what she was going to do when the experiments didn't work out, what was her backup plan, the student said, "I don't know." So the committee actually failed her for that aspect of her, I don't know, it was a comprehensive exam or something else. But anyway, they said, do it over, come back, and have answers to these questions. The student came back and hadn't read the background, couldn't answer the background questions again. When this faculty member asked, what are you going to do if the experiments don't work out? The student said, why do you keep asking me this? And 2 of the committee members passed the student, and the person who wrote to us didn't. And so the concern that this person raised was, what happens in a fixed 5-year PhD program if now this person who clearly isn't demonstrating what we talked about, the skills that represent, I understand how science works and I am being trained as a scientist, but still can just wait long enough, slip through the cracks, and get a degree? And what does that do to the degree?
Hey, Dan, well, I got something to say to you. What happens to that student in their current program, which is not a fixed-length PhD? And I think we probably have all known students like this, or even been those students where maybe it's not for you. Maybe you do slip through the cracks, and 5 years goes by, 6 years goes by, 7 years goes by, and then a lot of times the end of that, the end game, is you end up getting the PhD by default just through you've been there for.
But you did it in 9 years rather than 5 years.
Yeah, and so the situation being described is happening.
It's happening now.
With our current system, and I might argue that in a system, fixed length or not, with these mandatory checkpoints every 6 months, where there's data points, multiple data points over a period of time where no progress is really being made, then I think too often what is being conflated is, well, if we somehow get rid of the open-endedness of these programs, we're somehow also getting rid of rigor and standards. And that's not at all what we're saying. We talked about the comparison to medical school. It's a fixed-year program, but if you fail all your exams, you're not going to finish with an MD, right? So I think to a certain degree, the endpoint, whether it's fixed or not fixed, is inconsequential.
It's not material to the discussion.
Yeah, does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's just one more reason that we're going to have this conversation about what does a PhD mean, and are there better ways to measure it than the ways we've been measuring it?
And so our friend Adrian, he had a lot to say on the topic, and I know Adrian shares our passion for wanting to improve training and have it be as impactful on trainees as possible. And one concern he had, which is really valid, is sometimes as a student, as a trainee, maybe you don't feel ready at 5 years. Maybe you don't feel sufficiently ready to make that next step. Or your
advisor notices maybe you're not ready.
Yeah, and maybe it's based on, hey, what you want to do, I think you can get there, but I don't think you're quite there right now. But with another year, maybe you can get there. And I guess what I would say to that is that could be true for students, absolutely. And I think that was true for Adrian. He was talking about his personal experience. And, I love sort of what the Australian system has too, and was mentioned by one of the U.S. programs, is options do exist to extend that time if it needs to be for some, situational reason, or if you just feel like you need it to continue on. Like you just, maybe getting that last paper out is important for your career goals and you want to stay and do that, and there are mechanisms in place to do that. But what doesn't happen is, maybe I want to go out and become a science writer or a science policy expert or go on to a policy fellowship or who knows what. And another year in the lab, year 6 in the lab, is not going to make me more quote unquote ready for that career. Right. And so what is being gained by anyone for me, having my degree held hostage from me for this extra year until some publication comes out that's really not even that helpful for me and my CV?
You got to wait another year to repay your student loans.
Yeah, sure.
So it's good.
Yeah, there you go.
Is that how that works?
Maybe so. But anyway, I really appreciated all the feedback we got from everyone this week. That was so fun, and really has focused us, Dan, on wanting to over the next few months, really trying to explore this fundamental question of what is a PhD and what is PhD training all about in the first place.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I think one that we will crowdsource the answer to. So look out for some communications where we ask you to submit your feedback.
And you know what we will say when we find that PhD and what it's all about?
I don't know.
We will say, hello.
Oh, wow. Good branding insert.
PhD.
Okay. Well, if you have a question or a topic idea, we would love to hear it. You can email us podcast@hellophd.com, send us a tweet at hellophd, or leave us a message on the Facebook page. If you like the show, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love the feedback, and it helps listeners find the show. If you'd like to support us, you can become a patron. Simply go to our website and click the Become a Patron button, or visit patreon.com/hellophd. We'd appreciate the beer money, and thank you for the ongoing support from our patrons.
All right, Dan, this was a fun show. I still need to catch up on some sleep from my camping escapades.
I feel great. I feel great.
You look so well rested.
I came out and ate a hot dog and went back home.
Oh, man, my bed felt so good on that night.
I believe you.
Two greatest inventions of mankind.
Air conditioning has to be one of them.
Air conditioning and in-air Wi-Fi.
In air?
On the plane.
Oh, on the plane. It's like, wow. It's in the, where else is it going to be?
It's not on the tubes anymore.
Not over tubes. That's true.
All right, Dan, I'll catch you next time.
We'll see you then.